"Ma'am, are you genuinely planning to raise catfish in the middle of a wheat field?" The man who asked that question was Dale Ferris, the county agricultural extension agent. And he said it the way you might say something to a person who had just announced they intended to fly to the moon by flapping their arms. He was standing at the edge of Mabel Ostrander's North Field in the summer of 1988, holding a clipboard, squinting at the shallow depression she had hired 2 men to dig the week before. Behind him, her nearest neighbor, Clarence Webb, had driven over specifically to watch. Clarence had his thumbs in his belt loops. He was already smiling before Dale even finished the sentence. Mabel Ostrander was 41 years old that summer. She had been farming this land in central Kansas. 412 acres her late father had bought in 1952 for nearly 2 decades. She knew drought, she knew debt, but it was a dry July. She knew the particular silence of a kitchen at 5 in the morning when the numbers in a ledger book will not cooperate, no matter how many times you add them up. And she knew, with a certainty that had been building quietly inside her for almost 3 years, that wheat alone was going to bury her before she turned 50. She looked at Dale Ferris and she said, calmly, "Not catfish, tilapia." And yes. Clarence laughed out loud. Dale wrote something on his clipboard. Neither of them asked her why. That was the part that stayed with her longest in the years that followed. Not the laughter, she had expected that, but the fact that not a single person, in all the months she had spent quietly researching, quietly planning, quietly spending her savings on soil tests and water reports and one very long phone call with a professor at Kansas State. Not one person had ever asked her to explain her reasoning. They had all simply assumed there was no reasoning to explain. The trouble had started, as most farm trouble does, slowly, and then all at once. Mabel's father, Heinrich Ostrander, had come to Kansas from a small town in Minnesota in 1949, with a wife, a secondhand tractor, and an almost religious conviction that hard red winter wheat was the crop God had designed specifically for this part of the country. He was not wrong. For 30 years, the Ostrander farm ran the way a good clock runs. Not exciting, not glamorous, but steady. When Heinrich died of a heart attack in 1979, he left Mabel the land, the equipment, a mortgage that was nearly paid off, and the unspoken expectation that she would keep doing exactly what he had done. She had tried. She had genuinely tried. But the 1980s were not the 1950s. Federal price supports that her father had counted on, like a second foundation, were being quietly dismantled. The input costs, fuel, fertilizer, pesticide, climbed every year, while the price she got per bushel seemed to move in the opposite direction. In 1985, the farm showed a net loss for the first time in its history. In 1986, the same. In 1987, Mabel sat at her kitchen table in February with a tax document in one hand and a cup of cold coffee in the other, and she did the arithmetic 3 times because she did not want to believe it the first 2 times. She was not going to be able to sustain this for another decade, maybe not even for another 5 years. Her husband, Gene, was a decent man. He was not a farmer. He worked maintenance for the school district in town, and he had always been careful not to second-guess decisions about the land. But that February night, when she showed him the numbers, he said the thing that people say when they don't know what else to say. "Maybe we should think about selling the North 40. Mabel didn't answer him. She folded the tax document and put it back in its envelope and went to bed. But she did not sleep. She lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about her father, who had bought that North 40 specifically because of the water table underneath it. "That ground has water in it," he had told her once. "Never forget that." That ground remembers water. She had not thought about that in years. She started thinking about it now. The research took her the better part of 18 months. This was 1987, 1988. There was no internet, no YouTube, no algorithm to feed her the answer. There was the county library. There were agricultural journals she ordered through the mail. There was a spiral notebook that she filled, and then a second one. She wrote letters, actual letters, with stamps, to university extension programs in Arkansas, Missouri, and Alabama, states where inland aquaculture had been practiced longer than in Kansas. Most of them wrote back. Some of them sent pamphlets. What she learned, piece by piece, was this: tilapia, raised in earthen ponds, could produce more protein per acre than almost any conventional crop. They were hardy. They could tolerate Kansas heat. They grew fast. The market for fresh fish in the Midwest was chronically undersupplied. Most of the tilapia consumed in the region was imported, frozen, and arrived having lost a significant percentage of its quality. A local producer, selling fresh, could charge a premium that a wheat farmer could not begin to imagine. And this was the part that felt almost like a door opening in a wall. She had stopped believing had doors. The North Field had exactly the kind of clay-heavy subsoil that held water. Her father had been right. The ground remembered water. It would hold a pond. She did not tell Jean about any of this until she had filled the second notebook. When she finally sat down with him at the kitchen table and laid it all out. The soil tests she had paid for herself, the water table data, the market research, the letters from the professors, the projected profit per acre versus wheat. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the notebooks. He looked at her. He said, "Mabel, this is a wheat farm." "I know what it is," she said. "I'm trying to figure out what it could be." Jean was not opposed to her, exactly. He was afraid, which is different, though from the outside the two can look identical. He did not say no, but he did not say yes either. He said, "Let's think about it." And in the months that followed, "Let's think about it," was where the conversation always ended. Mabel stopped waiting for a different answer. In the spring of 1988, she hired the two men to dig. She started with 3 ponds, small ones, a quarter-acre each, dug into the northeast corner of the North Field, where the clay was thickest and the water table was closest to the surface. The excavation cost her $4,000 she did not have to spare. She financed it by selling a piece of equipment she had been meaning to repair for 2 years and had privately accepted she probably never would. The day the water started filling the first pond, she stood at the edge of it for a long time. The water was the color of old pewter in the afternoon light. It smelled like something alive. She felt, for the first time in years, something she had almost forgotten the name of. It took her a moment to identify it. Hope was what it was. Not optimism. That was different. Lighter. Easier. This was heavier. This was the kind of hope that has done its homework. But she was, for the record, completely alone in feeling it. Dale Ferris filed a report with the county that gently suggested Mabel Ostrander might be making a significant error in land use judgment. Clarence Webb told anyone at the feed store who would listen that she had lost her mind after Heinrich died, which was an interesting theory given that Heinrich had been dead for 9 years and she had been running the farm competently, if not profitably, for all 9 of them. Her sister, Pauline, called from Wichita to ask if everything was all right at home, in the tone that implied she was inquiring about Mabel's mental state rather than her plumbing. Jean, for his part, grew quieter. Not unkind. He brought her coffee in the mornings, asked about the ponds, listened when she talked. But There was something behind his eyes that she recognized as the expression of a man who has decided to wait and see, and is not entirely confident in what he is waiting to see. The fish arrived in June, 500 fingerlings from a supplier in Arkansas, packed in oxygenated bags and shipped overnight. Mabel drove to the freight office at 4 in the morning to pick them up herself. She stood in the parking lot of that freight office in the dark, holding a bag of fish up to the light of a single bulb above the loading dock door, looking at those thin silver shapes moving in the water, and she thought, well, here we are. She released them into the first pond just as the sun came up. The first year was the hardest, not because anything went catastrophically wrong. In fact, almost everything went right, which was its own kind of disorienting. The fish grew. The water stayed clean. The clay held. But the market work was brutal. Mabel spent that entire first year driving to Kansas City on Thursdays, showing up at restaurant back doors with a cooler of fresh tilapia and a price sheet she had typed on her typewriter. Most chefs turned her away. A few were politely curious. 2, a Vietnamese restaurant on the east side and a small, upscale place downtown that described itself as New American, bought from her. That was enough. Not enough to profit, but enough to continue. Meanwhile, the wheat that remained on the south fields underperformed again. A late frost, then too much rain at the wrong time. The farm's overall financial picture that year was approximately the same shade of gray it had been the year before, neither improving nor worsening in any dramatic way, which meant the ponds were, at minimum, not making things worse, which was more than anyone had predicted. Clarence Webb predicted, specifically, that she would be out of the fish business by August. When August came and the fish were still swimming, he revised his prediction to Thanksgiving. When Thanksgiving came, and the ponds were frozen over for winter, but the fish were alive underneath, and she had a second batch of fingerlings already ordered for spring, he stopped making predictions out loud, and simply maintained, privately and to anyone who brought it up, that it was only a matter of time. The women at Mabel's church were kinder, but not significantly more encouraging. They brought her casseroles when Gene had his gallbladder out in the fall of 1989, and they asked about the fish with the careful brightness of people asking about a hobby they think is slightly eccentric. Nobody asked about profit margins. Nobody asked about the soil tests or the water table data or the letters from Kansas State. They just nodded and said things like, "How interesting." And you always were determined, Mabel. Determined, as if what she was doing were a personality quirk, rather than a business decision, made on the basis of 18 months of research. She kept the second notebook in her kitchen drawer, and sometimes, on the bad nights, she took it out and read through her own notes just to remind herself that she had not invented this out of nothing. The turn came slowly, as turns usually do, and then it was simply there. By 1991, she had expanded to 6 ponds. The 2 Kansas City restaurants had become 7. A grocery co-op in Lawrence started carrying her fish. A food writer for a regional magazine drove out to the farm in the spring of 1992 and spent an afternoon with Mabel walking the pond edges. And the article that came out 3 months later was titled, "The Wheat Farmer Who Learned to Think Like Water." Mabel's phone rang for 2 weeks straight after that article. The money changed in 1993. Not dramatically, not in the way of lottery wins or Hollywood endings. But there was a Thursday in March of 1993 when Mabel sat at that same kitchen table where she had looked at those tax documents in 1987, and the ledger in front of her showed, for the first time in a decade, a number on the right side of 0. Not a large number, but unambiguously, genuinely, on the right side. She didn't call anyone. She sat there for a while. She made a new pot of coffee. She thought about her father and the way he used to say that ground remembers water. And she wondered if he had known, in some part of himself that never quite made it into words, that the north field was for something other than wheat. Jean came in from the driveway where he had been working on his truck. He saw her face before she said anything. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his work jacket and looked at her. And she turned the ledger around so he could read the number. He sat down slowly. He looked at the number for a long time. "Mabel," he said finally, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I thought you were wrong," he said. "Not just that it might not work. I genuinely thought your reasoning was wrong. That you were." He stopped, started again. "I read those notebooks. Did you know that? After you fell asleep, that first winter, I read them all the way through, and I still thought you were wrong." He shook his head. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you 5 years of actual faith." Mabel looked at her husband of 23 years. She had known this conversation was coming, had known it in the way you know the weather is going to change, by the way the air feels before it does. She had imagined, in her harder moments, that she might feel triumphant, vindicated. She was surprised to find that what she actually felt was tired and tender and something close to relieved. Not because she needed him to admit it, but because they could now stop carrying that silence between them. "Read the next notebook," she said. "I've been keeping a third one." There is something that almost no one who heard Mabel Ostrander's story in its later years knew about. Something she did not advertise, because it was the kind of thing that is difficult to explain without sounding like you are making a larger claim than you intend. Her maternal grandmother, Friederike, had come to Minnesota from a small village in the Rhine Valley of Germany in 1911. Friederike had grown up near a stretch of the Rhine where families had practiced something called Teichwirtschaft, pond farming, for generations. Not as a novelty, as a serious, centuries-old agricultural tradition. Carp, primarily, raised in managed earthen ponds alongside grain crops, the pond water used to irrigate and fertilize the surrounding fields. The fish sold at market every autumn. It was integrated farming before anyone in America had a word for integrated farming. Friederike had mentioned it once when Mabel was perhaps 10 years old during a Sunday dinner. Just briefly, the way you mention something, you assume everyone already knows. In the old country, the farmers kept fish ponds alongside the wheat. Mabel had been 10. She had been more interested in the dessert. But somewhere in the decades between that Sunday dinner and that February night in 1988, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the memory had surfaced. Not dramatically, not as an epiphany. More like something you find in a coat pocket, worn smooth at the edges. That you had forgotten you were carrying. Teichwirtschaft, her grandmother's word. Her grandmother's knowledge. Her grandmother's knowledge carried across an ocean half buried in Minnesota soil, waiting. When she mentioned this to the food writer, who came out in 1992,